What if the most devastating earthquake sequence in American history was not recorded accurately because it destroyed evidence that was never supposed to exist? What if the tremors that shook 3 continents in 1812 were not random geological events, but the final chapter in the erasure of a civilization so advanced, so impossible to explain, that its destruction had to be blamed on nature itself, between December of 1811 and February of 1812? The New Madrid fault zone in the central United States produced earthquakes so powerful they rang church bells in Boston, reversed the flow of the Mississippi River, and created temporary waterfalls where flat land had existed for millennia. Within the same 18-month period, Caracas in Venezuela was leveled by a quake that killed more than 20,000 people in 7 minutes. Constantinople suffered massive destruction. Cities across Europe reported structural damage from tremors whose epicenters were never officially identified. The timing is impossible. The scale is impossible. And the aftermath is even more impossible. Because when we examine maps, paintings, and written records from before 1812 and compare them to what came after, we find something deeply disturbing. Cities that should not have existed vanished. Architecture that could not have been built with available technology destroyed. Populations that had no explanation for their size erased. And within a generation, the official story had already been rewritten to claim that what was lost had never really been there at all. This is not a story about earthquakes. This is a story about what earthquakes were used to hide. And once we see the pattern, once we trace the architecture that was buried, the populations that disappeared, and the maps that were redrawn, the entire narrative of the 19th century begins to collapse. Because 1812 was not a disaster. It was a reset. And the evidence is still there, waiting beneath the rubble, for anyone willing to look. Let us begin with the timeline itself, because the timing of the 1812 earthquakes defies every principle of random geological activity. On December 16, 1811, at 2:15 in the morning, the first massive earthquake struck the New Madrid region. It was so powerful that it woke President James Madison in Washington, D.C., more than 800 miles away. The Mississippi River temporarily reversed its flow. Islands disappeared. New lakes formed overnight. Eyewitnesses reported the ground rolling in visible waves, like the surface of the ocean. Then, on January 23, 1812, a second earthquake of equal magnitude struck the same region. More destruction. More land reformation. More impossible phenomena that geologists still cannot fully explain. And then, on February 7, 1812, a third earthquake struck. This one was the most powerful of all, estimated at magnitude 8.8. It rang church bells in Boston, cracked buildings in Charleston, and was felt across more than 50,000 square miles. The Mississippi River changed course permanently. Entire forests sank into newly formed swamps. And settlements that had stood for decades simply vanished. But here is where it becomes strange. Within the same 18-month window, on March 26, 1812, the city of Caracas in Venezuela was completely destroyed by an earthquake. Not damaged. Destroyed. The cathedral collapsed during Mass, killing thousands. Government buildings crumbled. The death toll exceeded 20,000 in a matter of minutes. The Spanish colonial authorities immediately declared it divine punishment for the independence movement, a convenient narrative that silenced questions about what had really been destroyed. At the same time, across the Atlantic, Constantinople reported severe earthquake damage. So did cities across the Mediterranean. So did regions of Central Europe. All within 18 months. All catastrophic. All perfectly timed to destroy urban centers that, according to the official timeline, should have been primitive settlements, not sprawling cities requiring advanced infrastructure. Geologists today dismiss this as coincidence. They claim seismic activity occurs in clusters. They wave their hands and point to tectonic plates. But when we examine the historical record, when we look at what was destroyed and what replaced it, coincidence becomes impossible to accept. Because the earthquakes of 1812 did not merely destroy cities. They erased architectural evidence. They erased populations. They erased entire styles of construction that contradicted the official story of human progress. And they did it all at once, as if someone had pressed a button and triggered a global reset. Now we must examine what was actually destroyed, because this is where the cover-up becomes undeniable. Before 1812, maps of the Mississippi Valley show something historians refuse to discuss. They show cities. Not villages. Not outposts. Cities. Settlements with geometric layouts, grid patterns, defensive walls, and infrastructure that should not have existed in a supposedly undeveloped frontier region. French maps from the 1700s depict urban centers along the Mississippi with populations in the thousands, with churches, government buildings, multi-story structures, and port facilities sophisticated enough to handle international trade. Spanish documents describe fortified towns with stone architecture, paved roads, and public squares. American surveyors in the early 1800s reported encountering ruins of massive stone structures that local indigenous populations claimed had always been there, built by people who came before. Then 1812 happened. And when the maps were redrawn in 1815, 1820, 1830, those cities were gone. Replaced on paper with empty wilderness, scattered settlements, and the word uninhabited written across regions that had previously shown dense urban development. The official explanation is simple. The earthquakes destroyed everything, and the maps were corrected to reflect reality. But this explanation collapses under the slightest examination. Because if the cities existed before 1812, why do no contemporary accounts describe their construction? Why do no records exist of the labor, materials, and logistics required to build urban centers of that scale? And why, after the earthquakes, did the rebuilt settlements look nothing like what had been destroyed? Look at New Madrid itself. Before 1812, it was described as a thriving town with Spanish and French architecture, stone buildings, defensive structures, and a population supported by agriculture and trade that made no sense for its location. After 1812, it was a collection of wooden shacks and dirt roads. The stone structures were gone. The architectural sophistication vanished. And within 20 years, historians were already claiming that the pre-earthquake descriptions had been exaggerated, that travelers had romanticized what was really just a frontier outpost. But the travelers did not exaggerate. They documented what they saw. And what they saw was architecture that did not belong in the official timeline. Architecture that suggested the Mississippi Valley had been home to a civilization far more advanced than the scattered indigenous tribes and European settlers who occupied it in the early 1800s. The same pattern appears in Caracas. Before the 1812 earthquake, the city was described as having architecture that rivaled European capitals. Massive stone cathedrals. Government palaces with ornate facades. Multi-story residential buildings with advanced engineering. All supposedly built by Spanish colonists in less than 300 years, despite the fact that Spain itself struggled to construct such buildings at home. After the earthquake, Caracas was rebuilt, but differently. Simpler. Smaller. The new buildings bore no resemblance to what had been destroyed. It was as if the earthquake had not merely knocked down structures, but had erased an entire architectural language from existence. And within a generation, the grand buildings of pre-earthquake Caracas were already being described as exaggerated legends, dismissed as colonial propaganda that never reflected reality. This is not how architecture works. This is how cover-ups work. But the most disturbing anomaly is not architectural. It is demographic. Because when we examine population records before and after 1812, the numbers do not make sense. Before the earthquakes, census records and traveler accounts describe populations in the affected regions that are far larger than the official history admits. The Mississippi Valley supported tens of thousands of people in organized settlements. Caracas had a population approaching 50,000. These are not small towns. These are cities. Cities require food systems, water systems, trade networks, governance structures, and an economic base capable of supporting non-agricultural workers. After the earthquakes, the populations crashed. Not just from deaths during the events themselves, but from a systematic disappearance that continued for years afterward. Entire communities simply vanished from records. Census data became incomplete, contradictory, deliberately vague. And when populations began to grow again in the 1820s and 1830s, the new inhabitants bore no cultural continuity with those who had come before. In the New Madrid region, indigenous tribes reported that the earthquakes drove away the old people, a phrase that appears repeatedly in oral histories but is never explained in official documents. Who were the old people? Where did they go? And why do the tribes describe them as distinct from both European settlers and indigenous populations? In Caracas, the post-earthquake rebuilding involved a massive influx of new settlers, but their origins are suspiciously undocumented. Records simply state that colonists arrived to rebuild, without explaining where these colonists came from, who organized their migration, or why they arrived in such large numbers immediately after the disaster. This is the behavior of a managed repopulation program, not a natural recovery from catastrophe. Disasters do not produce coordinated resettlement efforts. Disasters produce chaos. But the aftermath of 1812 looks organized, deliberate, controlled. As if the earthquakes cleared the land, and then a new population was installed to replace what had been removed. The population paradox extends even further when we examine birth and death records. In many affected regions, records from before 1812 are incomplete or missing entirely. Records from after 1815 are suddenly meticulous, detailed, and organized according to standardized formats. It is as if the record-keeping systems themselves were reset, as if someone decided that history would begin again from a clean slate, and everything that came before could be safely ignored. This is not how societies recover from disasters. This is how societies are rewritten. Now we must confront the cartographic evidence, because this is where the cover-up becomes impossible to deny. Maps are snapshots of reality. Cartographers do not invent cities. They document them. When a map shows a settlement, that settlement exists. When a map shows infrastructure, roads, fortifications, that infrastructure is real. Maps are evidence. And the maps from before 1812 show us a world that contradicts everything we have been taught. French maps of the Mississippi Valley from the 1770s and 1780s depict the region as densely populated. They show geometric city layouts. They show roads connecting settlements in patterns that suggest centralized planning. They show fortifications far too sophisticated for frontier outposts. These are not crude sketches. These are detailed surveys, created by professional cartographers working for colonial governments who had every reason to document their territories accurately. Spanish maps of Central and South America from the same period show similar patterns. Cities with populations that should not have existed. Infrastructure that required industrial-level organization. Trade networks that imply economic systems more advanced than the official timeline allows. Then, after 1812, these maps were replaced. New surveys were conducted. New editions were published. And the cities that had appeared on earlier maps either vanished entirely or were downgraded to ruins of unknown origin. The geometric layouts disappeared. The roads were redrawn as wilderness trails. The fortifications were relabeled as indigenous earthworks, despite bearing no resemblance to known indigenous construction techniques. This was not a correction. This was an erasure. Why would cartographers deliberately remove cities from maps? Why would governments commission new surveys that contradicted their own previous records? Unless the goal was not accuracy but concealment. Unless the earthquakes of 1812 provided the perfect excuse to redraw the maps and claim that what had been destroyed had never really existed at all. Some of these original maps still survive in archives. They are rarely displayed. They are seldom referenced in academic work. And when researchers do bring them up, they are dismissed as errors, as speculative cartography, as artistic interpretations rather than factual surveys. But the maps are too detailed to be errors. They show distances, coordinates, landscape features. They were created by professionals who stake their reputations on accuracy. The maps do not lie. The maps show us that the world before 1812 was not the primitive frontier we have been taught to imagine. It was a populated, organized, architecturally sophisticated world. A world that was destroyed and then deliberately erased from history. Even the earthquakes themselves contain anomalies that geologists cannot explain. The New Madrid earthquakes were some of the most powerful seismic events ever recorded in North America. Yet they occurred in a region with no significant tectonic plate boundaries. The New Madrid seismic zone is an intraplate fault, a type of fault that should not produce earthquakes of such magnitude. Modern geologists still debate why the region experienced such catastrophic seismic activity, because the underlying geology does not support the official explanation. Some researchers have noted that the earthquake sequence exhibited patterns inconsistent with natural tectonic movement. The aftershocks continued for years, but in a progression that suggested artificial triggering rather than natural stress release. Eyewitness accounts describe phenomena that geology cannot explain. Lights in the sky before the earthquakes. Electromagnetic disturbances affecting compasses and instruments. Ground liquefaction on a scale that should not have been possible in the soil composition of the region. Then there is the matter of the simultaneous global seismic activity. For 3 continents to experience catastrophic earthquakes within an 18-month period is statistically improbable to the point of impossibility. Tectonic plates do not synchronize across hemispheres. Earthquake clusters occur regionally, not globally. Yet in 1811 and 1812, the entire planet seemed to convulse at once. This raises a question that geologists refuse to ask. What if the earthquakes were not entirely natural? What if they were triggered, amplified, or weaponized by a technology we no longer understand? Before you dismiss this as fantasy, consider the evidence. Consider the timing. Consider the fact that the earthquakes destroyed precisely the structures that contradicted the official timeline while leaving others intact. Consider that the rebuilding efforts that followed were coordinated, organized, and systematic in ways that natural disaster recovery never is. Consider that in the ruins of Caracas, survivors reported finding metallic debris that melted during the earthquake, despite stone and wood being the primary building materials. Consider that eyewitnesses in the Mississippi Valley described hearing sounds like thunder coming from underground before the tremors began, sounds that continued for weeks after the main shocks. Consider that every civilization throughout history has myths of weapons that could shake the earth, that could call down fire from the sky, that could level cities in moments. What if those myths were memories? What if the technology existed? And what if 1812 was the last time it was used? When we assemble all the anomalies, the architecture, the populations, the maps, the timing, a single conclusion becomes unavoidable. Before 1812, a civilization existed in the Americas and across the globe that was far more advanced than the official history admits. This civilization built cities with stone. It organized populations in the tens of thousands. It created infrastructure that required engineering knowledge beyond what scattered colonists and indigenous tribes possessed. It left traces in every map, every traveler account, every survey conducted before the Great Erasure. But this civilization did not fit the narrative. It contradicted the story of European colonization. It contradicted the story of indigenous primitiveness. It contradicted the carefully constructed timeline that placed advanced civilization only in Europe and only after the Renaissance. So when the earthquake struck, when the cities crumbled and the population scattered, someone made a decision. The ruins would be buried. The maps would be redrawn. The records would be altered. And a new history would be written, a history in which the Americas were an empty wilderness waiting to be civilized, a history in which the destroyed cities had never existed at all. This was not done by accident. This was not the natural consequence of disaster. This was deliberate. Coordinated. A controlled rewriting of reality. Who had the power to execute such a plan? Who controlled the cartographers, the census takers, The historians, the government archives? Who benefited from erasing evidence of a pre-existing advanced civilization? The answer is uncomfortable but clear. The same institutions that wrote the history we are taught today. The same governments that redrew the maps. The same religious and academic authorities that declared what was real and what was legend. They had the power. They had the motive. And after 1812, they had the perfect cover story. But let us examine how people behaved after 1812, because behavior reveals truth. When documents lie. In the decades following the earthquakes, survivors exhibited a strange cultural amnesia. They spoke of the destroyed buildings as if they had always been ruins, as if they had been built by some ancient unknown race and had simply been damaged further by the earthquakes. Within a single generation, living memory was replaced by myth. This is not how memory works unless memory is being actively suppressed. Humans remember catastrophes. They tell stories. They pass down knowledge. Yet after 1812, the stories stopped. The architectural knowledge disappeared. The engineering techniques vanished. It was as if an entire civilization had been trained to forget. In Caracas, the rebuilt city was designed by European architects who claimed to be creating something new, something that fit the colonial vision. But locals reported that the ruins were being cleared away before anyone could properly document them, that stones were being repurposed, that foundations were being buried rather than built upon. This is not standard reconstruction practice. This is evidence concealment. In the Mississippi Valley, the few remaining stone structures from before 1812 were systematically dismantled in the 1820s and 1830s. Official records claimed the stones were needed for new construction. But photographs from the 1860s show that many of the new buildings were made of wood and brick, not repurposed stone. Where did the stones go? They were buried, scattered, hidden. Physical evidence was being eliminated. The survivors behaved not like people recovering from disaster, but like people living under occupation. They accepted new maps that contradicted their own memories. They accepted new histories that erased their own experiences. They allowed their cities to be rebuilt in ways that bore no resemblance to what had been destroyed. This is the behavior of a defeated population. A population that knows resistance is futile. A population that has been taught, through force or fear, that certain truths must never be spoken aloud. Why would someone want to erase an advanced pre-existing civilization? What purpose did the cover-up serve? The answer lies in control. In the early 1800s, European powers were consolidating their global dominance. They were creating colonies, extracting resources, establishing systems of governance that placed European culture at the apex of human achievement. This narrative required a specific version of history. It required the belief that civilization flowed outward from Europe, that the Americas and other colonized regions were primitive, empty, waiting to be uplifted. If evidence existed of advanced civilizations that predated European colonization, civilizations that built stone cities and organized complex societies without European guidance, then the entire justification for colonialism collapsed. The narrative of European superiority could not coexist with archaeological evidence of indigenous or pre-existing advancement. So the evidence had to be destroyed. Not just physically, but conceptually. The maps had to be redrawn to show wilderness where cities had stood. The ruins had to be reclassified as ancient and mysterious, their origins obscured, their builders made unknowable. And the earthquakes of 1812 provided the perfect mechanism for this erasure. Natural disasters are blameless. No one questions why a city falls during an earthquake. No one investigates whether the destruction served a political purpose. Earthquakes are convenient. They destroy evidence without leaving fingerprints. And if the earthquakes happen to strike at precisely the moment when European powers needed to consolidate their colonial narratives, well, that is just extraordinary timing. But there is another possibility, one even darker. What if the civilization that was erased was not indigenous at all? What if it was the remnant of something older, something global, something that contradicted not just colonial narratives but the entire structure of modern history. What if the architecture destroyed in 1812 was part of the same network of megalithic structures found worldwide? The same impossible engineering. The same geometric precision. The same scale mismatch with human proportions. What if the Mississippi Valley, Caracas, Constantinople were not isolated colonial cities but outposts of a civilization that once spanned continents? And what if 1812 was not the beginning of the erasure, but the end? The final chapter in a centuries-long effort to remove all traces of a world that came before our recorded history? Now we must confront the most disturbing possibility of all. What if the earthquakes were not entirely natural disasters? What if they were triggered, amplified, or directed by forces that understood how to weaponize geology? This is not as far-fetched as it sounds. Modern militaries have researched earthquake induction for decades. HAARP, ionospheric heaters, underground detonations, all of these technologies have been explored as potential means of triggering seismic activity. If such research exists today, is it impossible that similar knowledge existed in 1812? Consider the evidence. The earthquake struck with precision timing. They destroyed specific urban centers while leaving surrounding regions relatively intact. They occurred in patterns that do not match natural tectonic behavior. And they were followed by coordinated reconstruction efforts that looked nothing like organic disaster recovery. Consider also the eyewitness accounts. Lights in the sky. Electromagnetic disturbances. Sounds that preceded the tremors. Ground liquefaction in soil that should not have liquefied. These are not typical earthquake phenomena. They suggest external triggering, artificial amplification. We know from historical records that the civilization before 1812 possessed technologies we do not understand. We see evidence of this in the architecture, in the engineering, in the scale of construction. If they had advanced knowledge of materials and energy, is it impossible that they also understood resonance, frequency, and how to induce seismic activity? And if such knowledge existed, who controlled it after the fall? Who inherited the tools capable of shaking continents? And did they use those tools in 1812 to complete the erasure that had begun centuries earlier? This is speculation, but it is speculation built on evidence. Evidence of synchronized global seismic activity. Evidence of targeted destruction. Evidence of coordinated cover-up. And evidence that the official explanation, random geological coincidence, is statistically impossible. We have followed the evidence as far as it will take us. Now we must speak the conclusion aloud. 1812 was not a natural disaster. It was a reset. A controlled demolition of evidence. A synchronized erasure of a civilization that contradicted the narrative of human history being constructed by European colonial powers. The earthquakes destroyed cities that should not have existed. They scattered populations that could not be explained. They created the perfect conditions for rewriting maps, altering records, and replacing physical evidence with a new official story. And within a generation, living memory had been replaced with myth. The people who orchestrated this understood something fundamental. You cannot change history by decree. You must change the physical world. You must destroy the buildings. You must scatter the populations. You must redraw the maps. And you must do it all at once, so quickly and so completely that no one has time to document what is being lost. Earthquakes provided that mechanism. They were sudden. They were devastating. And they were blameless. No one questions the hand of God. No one investigates whether nature was given a little help. But the evidence remains. Not in documents, because documents were rewritten. Not in maps, because maps were erased. The evidence remains in the contradictions. In the timing that is too perfect. In the architecture that should not have existed. In the populations that vanished without explanation. In the geological impossibilities that scientists still cannot resolve. The evidence remains in the silence. In the questions that are never asked. In the theories that are dismissed without investigation. In the archives that are rarely opened and the maps that are never displayed. 1812 was the moment when the old world ended and the new world began. Not the world of primitive frontiers waiting to be civilized. The world of controlled narratives, erased evidence, and histories written by those who won the right to write them. And if they could erase an entire civilization in 1812, if they could rewrite the maps and scatter the populations and bury the ruins so completely that within 50 years people believe the official story, then what else have they erased? What other resets have occurred? What other catastrophes were not catastrophes at all, but operations? The ruins are still there. Buried beneath modern cities. Hidden in forests. Labeled as unknown origin in archaeological reports that no one reads. The ruins do not lie. The ruins remember. And they are waiting for us to remember too. Because 1812 was not the first reset. And it was not the last. It was simply the one that was recent enough, visible enough, documented enough, that we can still trace its outlines if we are willing to look. The question is not whether it happened. The evidence makes that clear. The question is, what are we going to do now that we know?